That beautiful feeling of going live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the broadcast. My name is Eric Wright. I'm going to be your host for today's Turbonomic Labs Live. This is Thursday, and Thursday is about sharing open content. The fun part about what we're doing here with the Turbonomic Labs as a platform is making sure that we can really share some of the stuff that me and my team and our entire customer community and just folks that are involved in the tech community are learning as we explore more stuff with classic virtualization. I could even call it legacy at this point. It's actually old enough. Things around generally like open source, around cloud technologies, around cloud native. So what we're going to talk about today is this really, really neat idea. And let me just spin up I'll get my thing here going here. The idea of how do we make sure that we're using Kubernetes on AWS in the most sort of optimal way. One of the most common questions that I get asked around, when I'm looking at Kubernetes on AWS specifically is, what's the right time where I would choose EKS versus Fargate? Now, the fun thing is this is a really neat moving target. So I decided to do a before you go down, let's throw down. Let's have a true idea of what we're heading into as we think about what we want to do when using EKS, whether we want to use Fargate, why you would use it, and we'll kind of quickly whip through some of the stuff in the console so that if you're brand new to this, you can understand, where you want to go and configure some stuff. I'd love to actually dive deep. We're going to do a bit of more of a deep dive into really just like operating Kubernetes. Today, this is the architect's view. So if you're thinking about architecting and using EKS, decisions you make before you deploy will be critical to whether you can use Fargate, and also you've got to understand why you would. So I think we should really, first of all, thank the amazing folks that are in the engineering teams and across the organization, AWS. They've done a ton to, number one, make sure that we can use really slick on-demand infrastructure, make sure that we can access stuff. And remember, we used to talk about the race to zero. And that sort of race to zero hasn't necessarily played out to zero, but despite the stuff that's going on in the world, and in fact, I would say because of everything going on in the world, we now have a huge opportunity to leverage like on-demand infrastructure. So if you're thinking about spinning up Kubernetes, like I'm all about metal, right? Kubernetes on metal, and if you're looking for stuff like that, I'll give my little shout out to my good friend Rob Hirschfeld. Check out stuff that he's doing with RackN, with digital rebar. Being able to push out Kubernetes on bare metal, on VMware, all over the place. So completely orchestrated underlay. So get your base stuff out there. However, let's assume for a moment that you are looking at, look, I just want to manage Kubernetes. I don't want to own that part of it. And this is kind of where we think about how they position Fargate. So I'm going to borrow some real, like just straight up imagery from AWS. So thanks again, to them. And this is my view and especially my customer experience, because I actually spoke at reInvent in 2019, whatever the last year was. Yeah, last year, in November 2019. And, back when we used to actually have events in person. So it's hard to imagine. It's been a crazy year. So if I look at this image, this tells you kind of the way you're doing it, the way Fargate does it. The goal of Fargate is to introduce the idea of serverless in, using EKS or just using Kubernetes in general. Now, the funny thing is Fargate is actually much more than that, because Fargate is a way to effectively be serverless implementation and serverless execution of containers. Just so happens that Kubernetes was the first target, so that you could actually deploy Kubernetes without having to think about how you operate your node groups specifically, right? How do you scale your nodes, et cetera, et cetera. And it also meant that by running Fargate as an extended sort of managed service, you would go in, you would configure Fargate, you would just throw your containers at it, you throw your pods up there, and it looks like a regular Kubernetes endpoint. You can use kubectl, you can use EKS ETL if you so desire, whatever you want for your command line, whatever your orchestration platform, it presents just as a Kubernetes API endpoint. So it's all magic under the covers, right? That's the idea. But what was fantastic about this idea with Fargate, as you can see here, is that on the left-hand side, you've got and this is really more the ECS side of the world, which, we'll dabble a bit at the end, but like ECS is running Fargate as well. So instead of, containers, it was necessarily like you're building your nodes, you're building your EKS, your desired node size for your clusters. You're making sure that you set your thresholds. You want to populate it, so you want to get the best utilization. So you have to think about sizing, scaling, and doing a lot of those things. And then when you've got those pods running, they're all basically eating up resources. Well, what if you actually could make it so that, number one, you got rid of that layer? So you go into Fargate, and the original Fargate console, which is kind of funny, we'll go and take a look at it because it's gone. If you've not been using Fargate, you've actually been migrated over. And that was the funny thing, as I was building the idea of this episode. It's fundamentally different than it was 6 months ago. So this means that, also part of the reason why you make decisions around how you architect things, because it's going to move around underneath you. So you would go to Fargate, you would just say, that's it, I want to deploy my containers. You deploy them to Fargate. It takes care of scaling underneath. You actually had complete abstraction and, unfortunately, complete obscurity. There was no way for you to understand what was going on underneath the covers, and you'd get a somewhat random bill, which would be, if done right, less than if you ran your EKS nodes and operated them yourself. So it's actually one less layer to worry about. So what they've done is they've actually moved so that you now have EKS, and you just attach a Fargate profile to your EKS node group, and then it will operate them and then start to do things like offloading your clusters. So you still set up your EKS. However, you can now, based on tagging and labeling, have your pods scheduled out into your Fargate so that they can then operate in that Fargate lifestyle, I'll call it, so that you can think about really, truly on demand, when needed. And then the real question comes, right? So Fargate wins for a variety of reasons. And if I look at the idea of, I'll call this is my architect hat here, and I'm going to bust out my, I don't have a whiteboard. I need a whiteboard. I'm going to get a whiteboard so we can do this better. You have what we call AMPRS, or ramps as the other one there. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So AMPRS, availability, manageability, recoverability, performance, recoverability, and security. So if you think as an architect and you want to understand how do you measure things, well, availability, done, right? You're architecting your platform. It is continuously available. You set how widely available it is based on whether it's across regions, across availability zones, across subnets. So there are considerations to make here. When you get into Fargate is a private service, because it actually has a lot of back-end integration with other things in the platform. So you've got manageability. So I'd say that we're definitely winning on a check for manageability, because you get rid of a lot of the underlying manageability problems. Performance, yeah, I'll give it a middle check. I'll call this, because on the performance side, you effectively, we talk about the idea of serverless spin up and stuff, but generally, if you're running Kubernetes and truly cloud native applications, they're kind of scaling as they need on demand. And if they're running hot, then, well, label them appropriately and tag them so that they stay in your live cluster. Definitely the idea of resiliency and recoverability. I call it the double R. So recoverability is technically, you should be building, if you're running stuff in Fargate, it's not a continuously running application for the most part. So your profile of whether you want to use Fargate is whether you're actually running true cloud native architectures. And security, lots of stuff that's baked in around the security side of it. So as you look across this, we target each one of them inside your Fargate profile. So if I draw my little Fargate box there, boy, that's a bad Fargate box. And so the idea is that you want to be able to get Fargate working for you, and it should be able to meet your requirements. However, this is where your mileage may vary. So I think there's kind of there's the side of it where we look at architecturally, like what's the right deployment pattern. I definitely just wrote on myself there. I wrote on myself. That's okay. So also, big shout out to Elizabeth and Navi and Chris, who are my production team, who have to live with me changing cameras all the time, and I really twist them up a lot. So when I look at what we've got for architecturally, when you do your setup, and actually let's jump over into the console and we'll take a look at what you want to consider. So under your core console, you find this, you go to EKS, makes sense, right? It pre-fills for you, Elastic Kubernetes service. Fantastic. I'm all about elasticity. Now let's take a look at Fargate. Well, here's a funny thing, right? If you actually went there a few months ago, you'd have got Fargate. Like it was its own portal. It was its own service. It's different now. In fact, when you type in Fargate, it defaults to ECS. How funny is that? And here's look, I know this is a fun part about containerization, or just a lot of AWS. They've got a lot of services in a lot of regions, and you will see some differentiation in the user experience and the user interface. So ECS has what we call the classic UI. So if I go into ECS, so you can actually go through and you can actually run ECS, and it has Fargate underneath it as well. So that you don't necessarily have to run active continuous EC2 instances. Remember, ECS is containers that are running on Amazon Linux as EC2 instances. You're just, using more containers per instance, so which is cool. But so anyways, if you go here and you end up in one console, all the containerization is in one place. So you've got ECS. We'll jump right down to EKS, and you'll notice the UI changed. So this is the I'll call it generation 2 or new UI and UX. So you'll see if you click any of those links up there, you'll go back to the old classic UI. God bless the poor kids that have to manage all this stuff. It's not an easy task. So if I make fun of it, it's purely in jest. It is not a poke at their capabilities and the talent of the teams. Doing this stuff at scale is pretty crazy. So what we've got here is you can create your cluster, and we could call it blah, we could call it whatever. You set your Kubernetes version, you want to default to the latest wherever possible. You've assigned some roles. I'm assuming that you've done certain things, right? You can set whether you want to do secrets management using KMS. You can set your tags. You go through, you configure what VPC it's going to run in. You configure, it just grabs all the subnets by default. You attach a security group to it. Let's just for fun. I'm actually not going to do this. I'm just going to say default. I won't, or I'll just blow it away at the end. This is only setting your cluster. So this is literally first defining your cluster configuration. And then we go to the second one. We're going to go, you can say public and private, or pure public. So let's go. We'll go 50-50. We'll split the line. You can set your logging. So your control plane logging. Remember the S in the security? Yeah, the S down at the bottom there. So the S in security, turn all this stuff on, because you need to make sure, especially if you have any public-facing endpoints, which is a fairly bad idea. You want to be very careful. You want to make sure you understand the security of that endpoint. You should be using security groups that are clearly defining who can have access. You should ideally have VPNs, et cetera, et cetera. But regardless of how you do it, you want to turn all this goodness on. So you want to make sure you're logging into CloudWatch. And then we say create. So now what it's doing, it's going, and you can see the little creating tag right here. So we're creating a brand new cluster. You can see I'm thinking long-term, I called it blah, but this was just for the purposes of going through the walkthrough. Now let's go back and take a look at one of the other clusters that I created actually like an hour ago. So now what I've got is I go inside, I've got the details. So I'm going to see my API server endpoint. You can even screenshot these if you want. You can, because the beauty part is I'm going to tear these down in about 22 minutes. So there's no security concerns unless you're really fast and you want to bust open my Kubernetes cluster right now and you happen to have a key. So you've got your general details, including your API server endpoints, which is what you'll use for your EKS cuddle or your cube cuddle. That's right, I said cuddle. It's actually CTL, but I'm trying to make everybody happy. I set my compute. So by default, we need to create a node group. So first thing we do is we need to have nodes to run on. I've actually got a node group here, but we'll walk through the brand new wizard. So I've got desired size of 2. It's actually failed because I had a problem before. So we'll walk you through in the other wizard. So you set your node groups. You've got your opportunity to create a Fargate profile. I'll show you in a second where that works. Your default networking that you assign to it. The fun part about AWS when you're operating the stuff is you're going to be clicking in and out. Every time you click on the thing, it takes you to, they're very good that you have a lot of click outs. And if you see that thing there, right? That little, this guy, it's the little pointy arrow that tells you it's going to open in a new tab. You can always spot an AWS admin because they have like 92 tabs open. So you're logging here just for funsies. I didn't turn on any logging. Update process. So if you're actually going to be right now, let's say I deploy as 1.17. We get our next revision of Kubernetes. AWS makes it available into their platform. And then what you do is you can actually do rolling updates across the nodes. So you'll see like that's day 2 operations. And then active tags, which are in here. So this is the most simplified environment. I literally have done nothing here, but it was just to give you a quick walkthrough of what the UI looks like. And then if I were to go out and I can take a look at my, so what you've got to do is you use a command line. So I'll just zoom in a bit so it's a little easier to read. So it's called EKS-CTL. And you can, if you're using Mac OS X, you can do a download. You can use Homebrew if you like. I don't like Homebrew, but I use it. There's a whole history behind that one, and I know people get a little irked when I talk about that one. So EKS-CTL get, you can literally just go through and type the different commands, and it will give you the details. So in this case, I can say get cluster. I can say get so all these things here. So I'm going to say EKS-CTL get cluster. Look at that. Looks like my other cluster got created. So what I'm seeing is my Disco KS. I've got another one I called Rapid Matter KS, and we've got a brand new one called Blah. So now what I can do is if I do an EKS-CTL get node group dash cluster, and we'll say rapid matter dash KS. Oops. Dash cluster, my bad. Okay, so there's no cluster active because there's no node group attached to that particular cluster. As we saw before, I actually had an error because I just created these like literally right before we did this. So let's go back and take a look. So if I look at my Rapid Matter, so I've got a create failed, but let's walk through the wizard here. So we're going to create a node group. We're going to call it node X. We're going to attach a role to it. Now I've pre-created a lot of these roles. So we've kind of cut over to two pieces, right? Remember, we're thinking architecturally, what are the things that I need to know about as I do this when I want to think about this versus, if I want to create a Fargate profile. So I've got mine set here as both public and private. It defaults, it shares all the different subnets that I've got available. However, your subnet design will indicate whether you can actually use Fargate, because I'll show you in a second. If you try and create it and there are no purely private subnets, it will get borked, as they say. I'm going to say allow remote access to nodes because, again, bad idea, but I'm just doing it to save the checkbox. I can say specific security groups, so I can assign a security group. Let's just assume that I've got something here. Well, yeah, I didn't create a default. I'll use the default again. Bad idea. You assign your Kubernetes labels. This is important, of course. If you're managing your Kubernetes infrastructure, label everything. Label everything. And of course, your tags. Let's just flip right through. You choose the node size that you want. So I have to decide architecturally how I want to lay these things out. Now, depending on how you design your compute infrastructure, do you want to be wide and short, so you're effectively doing a lot of small nodes? Do you want to go large and maybe a little bit more narrow in the breadth of the cluster? The way that you consume resources is going to be important. So we're at the A part of the AMPRS, right? Architecture and availability. I want to make sure if I want availability, I want to spread these things out. So you probably want to make sure that you don't have just two really giant nodes. Manageability. Well, now you have to think about that. Your selection here will indicate as well. I'll zoom in. Are you going to run just straight Amazon Linux 2, which is the default, or if you're using GPU enabled, then maybe I want to actually run some GPU workloads, which is cool because you can present that as a label to the nodes, and then you can tag your pods to run if you've got, say, machine learning or you've got other GPU requirements inside the containers that can leverage that stuff. So you can now make sure that your pods will get deployed to the appropriate spot. So I'm just going to say default. I'm going to say medium. I'm only going to put 20 gigs in there because, again, we're taking the defaults on this one. So minimum 2, maximum, I'm going to say 2, desired 2. Literally, we're just going to deploy a 2-node cluster. And you can adjust that later on. We go ahead, we say create. So what it does now is it's actually going to deploy my EC2 nodes based on this profile. It's going to prepare them for my Kubernetes. But what's the fun part? If I go into my clusters, actually, and I want to go to my compute, and I want to create my Fargate profile, I'm going to show you what happens when it doesn't work. I'm going to call this one Farscape because that's where you're going. I've created my pod role already based on the guide. Here's a cool thing. If you don't already know how to do this, just click the info button, and over there, God, it's hard to see. On the far right of the screen, this is really backwards because it's on the left of mine. You've got all the default for the what you need for the pod IAM execution role. So you want to use least privileges, subnets. You choose the subnets. You can see I've actually got one that's grayed out because it's the CIDR's not set correctly. But what will happen is if I try and deploy this, forget about tags, but this Fargate profile, you want to say that you have up to 50 tags that you can apply. And my favorite one, I call it run locale. And I call it Farscape. What I'll do is I'll actually tag my pods on deployment to, if they're sort of friendly for Fargate, then I'll actually move them over and they'll default to the nodes that are there. So I'm going to run my standard node, but then I've got this Fargate abstracted underlay that's actually running there. We've got a namespace that we're going to select the pods from. You select your labels. Again, oops, be careful. Autocorrect will get you. Okay. Now, when I try and go and create, it will complain greatly, as it should, that the subnet I've got here is actually not a private subnet. So because I've just gone and I've taken the standard configuration, I have to design my VPC purely to be able to be private. So what you will find is that you have to be very careful when you're designing your EKS implementation. You have to think, do I go an existing VPC? So we really should go from ground up, which is going to be VPC, subnets, security groups, then EKS. Think about where those VPCs are going to live. Remember, this is regions, this is availability zones. So your A for that availability is going to be tagged into there. The M for manageability also. If I need to make sure these are available across lots of regions, I have to think about that at the outset. Because if I do this wrong, you're in real trouble. You really are going to set yourself down a rabbit hole that has a hard line at the end, and you won't be able to continue because you've missed the requirement of having private subnets. So this is sort of the technical challenge that you face when you're architecting your EKS. If you're just going to fire it up real quick, EKS without Fargate, super easy, right? It'll spin up, but you have to be careful. It also talks about pricing. Now, here's one I want to be very careful with. I don't want to advise you on pricing necessarily, because that's up to you how you deem it, whether one is less expensive or appropriately priced relative to other services. So there's a lot of mileage variance when it comes to EKS. You can use the advisor, which is kind of cool. I got to give a shout out to my fine friends at Park My Cloud, also part of my Turbonomic company, and they do some really cool stuff where we can actually quiesce Kubernetes on Amazon. So that's a separate story. We're actually going to do that in a Turbo Tuesday coming up soon. So keep your eyes on the Tuesday that are Turbonomic focused, not open focused. And then around Fargate pricing. So I think you've seen kind of technically where you would inject one versus the other. So you start off with EKS. There's no longer Fargate standalone configuration. Set your EKS, set your node size, enable Fargate, and then label appropriately. Label and tag everything so that I know that as I create all of these environments, that I'm setting them up appropriately and they're meeting my security needs. So think like an architect, AMPRS, availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, and security. Recoverability, even your Kubernetes containers, that are scheduled by Kubernetes, do they need to be protected? So think about that. Different beast. That's not an AWS problem. That's you want to look at your backup solution. Okay, so we know what EKS looks like. You can get the pricing. You can dig in. They got a ton of great documentation. The documentation really very, very thorough. I'm a big fan of the way that AWS team does the documentation. You can go through. It's very well organized. Good to walk through. If you're studying for your AWS certifications, this is literally the place you should go. All of the information on the exams comes straight out of their documentation. You can even, if you decide that it needs a little bit of help, you can go through and scroll all the way to the bottom, and you can actually submit a pull request to update the documentation yourself. So shout out to the open source folks at AWS. They've learned the value of collaborative documentation as well as code. So they've got all the commands for EKS-CTL, all the commands for setting up Fargate, all the requirements where you can, we talked about ML. You can do things like they have ML for operations. They call it inferentia. So there's inferentia enabled nodes, the idea that it can scale more proactively. But if you're at that scale, you're probably not reading the documentation right now. If you go to the AWS blog, You can actually go through, find there's a lot of different tags. So, there was an announcement in January about Fargate price reduction. And so if you read through this blog, this is great. It tells you about anywhere from 35 to 50% reduction in pricing based on node type, based on what the utilization level is. The only downside to anything inside pricing is, look, this is no fault of AWS. It's confusing. If I do my Corey Quinn, right? Corey Quinn and the Duckbill group live off the fact that there's a real challenge with understanding pricing. So when you get into Fargate, you have to be very, very careful. So I'm going to give a shout out to my folks over at Trek 10, which is kind of cool. But that's the big thing, right? There's two things. When does Fargate win? So when Fargate wins is when you are generally further along with Kubernetes on the cloud. If you are thinking like, I'm widely adopting Kubernetes, and now I want to think about, I'm into day 2 operations. I know that we're deploying, we're managing, and I'm looking really and truly at how we use it and how we price our infrastructure and how we actually spend. Look, the truth is Fargate is not a performance play. It's a cost play, right? It's a manageability challenge. So what you're going to find where Fargate wins is generally in that area of, am I going to, is where I'm looking at utilization rates on those hosts. Remember how you had to choose whether do I want 10 T3 micros? Do I want 4 C5s? Whatever the layout's going to be. But this is right from one of their other blogs. It was actually that one that I showed you. So perhaps the most important is the upper and lower bounds, right? So on the lower end of utilization, it's potentially 30% based on depending on what your reservation rate is inside those nodes. So if you have a really highly utilized node, then you are likely going to be in the break even. And in fact, Fargate is more expensive. But on the upper end, this is where they talk about, if your cluster is fully utilized, Fargate will at least double your current compute costs, perhaps triple them. So think about that for a second. That's a scary prospect. And this is why you got to understand how you're using your EKS. So Trek 10 did a great blog, and I'm just going to call on the image because they did a beautiful job of laying it out. Right? If you actually look at the cool spots and hot spots of pricing, as you get up into this upper bound, depending on what your utilization and reservation rates is in your Kubernetes cluster, you're now in the wrong side of the ledger, because if you're using Fargate, but you're running really hot, well, it's using stuff continuously. So you're not actually getting the benefit of those lower utilization rates. If you're extremely low in utilization, okay, Fargate's going to win you some discounts, which is fantastic. But the truth is, go back to your design doc. Are you operationally running in a way that matches your continuous utilization? So this is where you want to think about that, right? So the Fargate costs, as if you think about just straight EC2, EKS versus rolling your own, one set. EC2, different set of problems versus Fargate. So I encourage you to kind of dig in, and it gets even better, because the last thing I want to talk about is, look, you're way down the enjoyment journey with Kubernetes. You've moved to Fargate. You're getting value out of it. Well, what if you want to get even more aggressive? Then you're really, truly like spinning up lots of containers very suddenly, and then they go away, or you're making sure that you can do more. Well, now you can actually, maybe you want to run some stuff right in ECS, but with Fargate under the covers. So you configure your Fargate for ECS, and now you use what they call Fargate Spot. And I know you're going to look at this, you can say, Eric, you've told me a lot of things. And this is why, when we go back to the fundamentals, how you designed it at the start and how you use it at the end are different, right? When you built your on-premises cluster, you bought 5 nodes, you deployed, you were smart, you got digital rebar, you blew out your Kubernetes infrastructure on them. You got 5 nodes at the start. You move the nodes around all you want, you got 5 nodes at the end. So this is the difference, right? When you're in on-demand, when you're in scalable infrastructure, when you're changing the way you use it, the way you price, the way you build, the way you use will vary greatly. So I think at the end, you probably have as many questions as you would hope that you had answers in this, but why did we do this, and why was this an important conversation? EKS is a really great way to deploy and operate Kubernetes. It has adjacencies to all of the other AWS services, meaning that you can just jump in, you can leverage your existing identity and access management. You can leverage your existing container registry. You can run a private registry, run your private code registries. You've got your security infrastructure. Remember, AMPRS, S is at the bottom, it should be at the top. Security is part of this, right? So think about the way that you protect your registry, the way you protect your user, all of those workflows are inside there. Well, now, you're really kind of profoundly pulled into the AWS lifestyle. You are in the ecosystem because your operations are there. And then as things change, they're going to get better. Prices will go down, of course, because they're finding greater adoption, and they're giving back to the customers in that way. So it is good. It's not they're making some money along the way, but the point here is that EKS is fantastic because you probably don't want to be building and managing your own Kubernetes nodes. And it's also a great way that you can federate once federation becomes a little easier and better. So you could actually run EKS as part of a globally federated Kubernetes infrastructure. So use it as you need. Fargate, I'm a fan. Use it as you can. But be very careful because you could be surprised by your Fargate pricing. And it's not the most transparent process. Again, shout out to Corey Quinn and the Duckbill group because they know that they're tackling this problem. So I hope that you now have a sense of where to think about your EKS journey, where Fargate will come in. Remember, 6 months ago, Fargate was its own service inside AWS. I can't tell you what 6 months will look like, but it's generally moving in the right direction, up and to the right, or whatever they call it, right? Everything is like the performance and capabilities are going to go one way, and the pricing is generally going to go towards the 0 mark, not really hitting 0. But there's the advantage that everyone, a lot of people, let's just say, are using this infrastructure, and you are gaining the benefits of that innovation because they're learning along the way and giving that back through the innovation to your customers. So do you want to manage your Kubernetes nodes? You probably aren't really caring about what I just showed you. Do you want to just use Kubernetes and present that as an endpoint to your developers and your operations team? Right? Let's use AKS. And I haven't talked about Azure because this was purely a Fargate conversation. So if you're in AWS, and that's your jam, then this is it. And if you want to be able to use Fargate, which I do recommend, but tread carefully, just make sure that you understand your utilization patterns and how you're consuming that, because you have to hit the right side of that adoption and the right side of utilization. Otherwise, you're going to be paying more. And I've spoken to a lot of people that swear by Fargate, love it to death, wouldn't do anything but to run in Fargate. I've also met a lot of folks who got surprised, and they were a little bit, well, they were surprised. We'll just put it that. So be careful. But use it, try it, understand, read the documentation. Fantastic. Again, go to aws.amazon.com. All the documentation is there, and reach out to the community. There's a ton of great folks that are involved in the AWS community. And if you have any questions, of course, you can always reach out to me. You can catch me on Twitter there. I am, at Disco Posse there. Oh, man. I still can't figure that. There we go. You can see it right there at Disco Posse. Yeah, my DMs are open on Twitter. You can reach out on LinkedIn. You can also hit me up on email if that's your thing. Eric.Wright, WRIGHT, at turbonomic.com. And I'm happy to help you to get you down your EKS and Fargate journey. And stay tuned. We've got more episodes that are coming up with Turbonomic Labs, which will include real, true, more hands-on stuff with using EKS, with using Kubernetes. We started a little bit of an OpenShift journey recently, so I'm actually going to also architect OpenShift to run multi-cloud, which is super cool. And hopefully I'm going to get my friend JJ Askar to join for some of that stuff. So with that, this is our Turbonomic Labs Turbo Thursdays. So hang tight. Have a great weekend, folks. Come on back and go to turbonomiclabs.com. Easy way to remember. And it'll take you right to the live page. It'll show you the schedule of upcoming episodes. And I hope to see you coming soon next Tuesday. And